The carriage jolted hard over a rut in the road, and Charlotte Bryant gripped the seat until her knuckles turned white. Outside the window, the gray stone towers of Ashworth Hall rose through the mist like a warning. In 3 hours, she would be married to a man she had never met. Her father sat across from her, his face pale and damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the weather. Henry Bryant had aged 10 years in the past month, ever since the letters from his creditors had stopped asking and started threatening. Charlotte had found him at his desk one night, head in his hands, papers scattered like fallen leaves. He had not needed to say the words. She had understood the moment she saw his eyes. "You do not have to smile at him," her father said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You do not have to love him. You only have to survive it." Charlotte turned her face to the window so he would not see the tears gathering. Survive it, as if marriage were a battlefield instead of a life. The wedding was small and cold, held in the private chapel at Ashworth Hall because the Duke had insisted on no public spectacle. Charlotte stood at the altar in a gown that had belonged to her mother, altered hastily to fit, and watched a tall man in dark clothing walk toward her with the stiff posture of someone approaching an unpleasant duty. Duke Edmund Ashworth did not smile. He did not look at her the way a groom was supposed to look at his bride. He looked at a fixed point somewhere above her head, said his vows in a flat, controlled voice, and slid a cold ring onto her finger without meeting her eyes. Charlotte matched his coldness with her own. If he wanted a wife in name only, she would give him exactly that and nothing more. She had already lost enough dignity in this arrangement. She would not beg for affection from a stranger. The wedding breakfast that followed was worse than the ceremony itself. The Dowager Duchess Margaret sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying a conquered land, her eyes moving over Charlotte's altered gown, her modest jewelry, the faint tremor in her hands. Every glance carried judgment, every silence carried contempt. "I hope you understand what you have married into," the Dowager said at last, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "This family has stood for 300 years without a whisper of scandal. I trust you will not be the first stain upon it." Charlotte felt her face burn, but she kept her spine straight. "I intend only to honor my husband's name, Your Grace, as any wife would." "We shall see." Edmund said nothing in her defense. He sat beside his mother, jaw tight, eyes fixed on his plate, and Charlotte understood then exactly what kind of marriage this would be. A transaction wrapped in silk, a debt paid with her whole life. That night, after the guests had gone and the great house had settled into its heavy silence, a maid led Charlotte to a bedchamber she had not expected. It was not the small guest room she had assumed would be hers, but a wide, sunlit chamber with tall windows overlooking the gardens, a fire already lit and crackling warm against the autumn chill, and fresh flowers arranged in a vase on the writing desk. "There must be some mistake," Charlotte said. "Surely this is not meant for me." "His Grace ordered it prepared for you, my lady," the maid said. "He said you would want a view of the gardens, and he asked that the fire be kept burning through the night, since the east wing runs cold this time of year." Charlotte stood very still in the doorway, staring at the fire, the flowers, the careful thoughtfulness of a room prepared by someone who had clearly given it real consideration. It did not match the cold, distant man who had barely looked at her all day. She told herself it meant nothing. A duke saw to the comfort of his household as a matter of pride, not affection. She would not let herself hope for anything more. The following morning Charlotte woke early, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, and wandered down to the breakfast room expecting to eat alone. Instead, she found Edmund already seated, a stack of correspondence beside his plate, his dark hair still damp from washing. He rose the instant she entered, pulling out her chair before a footman could reach it. "I did not expect you awake so early," he said. "I did not expect you to rise for me," she answered, more sharply than she intended. Something flickered across his face, there, and gone so quickly she almost missed it. He sat back down and gestured to the spread before them. "You will find the kitchen keeps a good table. If there is anything you prefer that is not offered, you have only to tell Mrs. Baxter, and it will be arranged." Charlotte studied him across the table, trying to reconcile the silent stranger from the wedding, with the man now quietly buttering toast and passing her the marmalade without being asked. "Your Grace, may I ask you something plainly?" "You may." "Why does this marriage matter to you at all? You could have paid my father's debts and walked away. Instead, you married me. I would like to understand why." Edmund set down his knife. For a long moment he said nothing, and Charlotte thought he would refuse to answer, retreating back into the cold formality of the day before. But then he spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "Because a debt paid without honor is still a debt. I would not have your father humiliated further, Nor would I have you cast aside as though you were a burden to be settled and forgotten. Whatever else this marriage is, I intend to treat you with respect. That much I can promise you. It was not a declaration of love. It was not even particularly warm, but it was honest, and honesty was more than Charlotte had expected from him. She found herself, against every instinct of caution she had built over the past humiliating year, almost believing him. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Charlotte explored the vast house and its gardens, met the staff who watched her with cautious curiosity, and slowly began to understand the shape of her new life. Edmund kept to his study most mornings, buried in ledgers and correspondence concerning the estate, but he always appeared for breakfast, always inquired after her comfort, always seemed to notice small things. He mentioned once, in passing, that she preferred her tea without sugar, and from that day forward it was served to her exactly so, without her ever having to ask twice. It should have meant nothing. Instead, it meant everything. To a woman who had spent the last year feeling invisible, humiliated, and discarded. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, however, made her disapproval known at every opportunity. She criticized the arrangement of flowers Charlotte chose for the drawing room. She questioned Charlotte's modest upbringing at every dinner, drawing comparisons to wealthier, more fashionable young ladies Edmund might have married instead. She spoke of Charlotte's father's debts openly in front of servants, as though daring Charlotte to object. Charlotte bore it silently for the first week, unwilling to cause discord in a household that was not yet hers to defend. But on the 8th night, as the Dowager launched into another cutting remark about Charlotte's gown at dinner, Edmund set down his fork with a sharp click against the china. "Mother," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge Charlotte had not heard from him before, "my wife's gown is not a subject open for discussion at this table. Nor will it be in the future." The Dowager's mouth thinned into a hard line, but she said nothing further that evening. Charlotte sat frozen, stunned, staring at her plate while her heart pounded strangely in her chest. He had defended her. Quietly, firmly, without hesitation, he had defended her. Later that night, as Charlotte walked the upstairs corridor unable to sleep, she found Edmund standing at the tall window overlooking the dark gardens, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said without turning. "My mother's manner tonight was inexcusable. I should have spoken sooner." "You spoke when it mattered," Charlotte said. "That is more than I expected." He turned to face her then, and in the candlelight his expression seemed less guarded than she had yet seen it. "I know this marriage was not your choice. I know I am, by most accounts, a difficult man to warm to, but I would ask one thing of you, if you are willing to grant it." "What is that?" "Patience," he said simply. "Give this house, and perhaps even me, a chance to prove it is not the cold place you believe it to be." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words against the careful kindness she had witnessed all week. The sunlit room, the tea without sugar, the sharp defense at dinner. Something in her chest, some wall she had built brick by brick over the past terrible year, shifted slightly out of place. "I can grant patience," she said quietly. "That much, I believe I can give." He nodded, and for the first time since their wedding day, something that almost resembled a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was small, barely there, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but Charlotte carried it with her back to her sunlit room, and for the first time since the carriage had carried her toward Ashworth Hall, she did not cry herself to sleep. Outside her window, the autumn wind moved through the gardens, and somewhere in the great house, a duke who had married a stranger out of duty found himself thinking, unexpectedly and against his own careful nature, that he wanted very much to see her smile again. Neither of them yet understood how much that small wish would come to matter, nor how many trials still waited in the shadows of the house to test whatever fragile thing had just begun to grow between them. 3 weeks into her marriage, Charlotte discovered that Ashworth Hall held far more warmth than its cold stone walls suggested, if one knew where to look for it. She found it in the kitchen, where the cook, a broad, cheerful woman named Mrs. Baxter, taught her how to make the honey cakes that Edmund had loved since childhood. She found it in the stables, where a young groom named Peter let her feed apples to the horses and told her stories about the old Duke, Edmund's father, who had died when Edmund was barely 19, and forced overnight into a role he had never wanted. "He was not always so serious, my lady," Peter told her one gray afternoon, brushing down a chestnut mare. "Before his father passed, the young master used to race his horse through these fields laughing like any other boy his age. It was the weight of it all that changed him. All those debts his father left behind, all those tenants depending on him. He took it onto his own shoulders and never once complained." Charlotte turned this new information over carefully in her mind. It explained so much about the guarded, careful man she had married. He had not become cold by nature. He had become cold by necessity, shouldering burdens meant for a much older man while he was still practically a boy himself. That evening she found him in his study long after the household had retired, hunched over ledgers by candlelight, dark circles shadowing his eyes. "You work too late," she said from the doorway. He looked up, startled, then gestured for her to enter. "The tenant farms need new roofing before winter sets in. The funds must come from somewhere that does not touch the household accounts. Surely this can wait until morning." "Winter does not wait, my lady." But he set down his pen anyway and rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. Charlotte crossed the room and, without quite knowing why, poured him a fresh cup of tea from the pot a servant had left cooling on the side table. She set it before him, no sugar, exactly as he had once noted she preferred her own. He looked at the cup, then at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You did not need to do that." "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to." It was a small moment, barely worth remarking on, and yet Charlotte felt something shift between them, as surely as a key turning in a lock. He drank the tea. He told her, haltingly at first and then with growing ease, about the roofing repairs, the failing tenant harvests, the weight of managing an estate that had been badly mismanaged before it fell to him. She listened, asked careful questions, offered what small suggestions she could from her own limited experience managing her father's much smaller household. He seemed surprised, and then genuinely grateful, that she had opinions worth hearing at all. "My mother believes a wife's only purpose is to look decorative and produce heirs," Edmund said quietly, staring into his cup. "I confess I did not marry expecting conversation." "And now?" He looked at her properly then, in the candlelight, in a way he had not looked at her since the wedding. "Now I find I rather enjoy it." Charlotte felt her cheeks warm, and busied herself gathering the empty teacup so he would not see it. But she carried the words with her up the stairs that night, turning them over and over like a coin she did not want to spend too quickly. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, however, seemed to sense the shift between her son and his new wife, and her disapproval sharpened accordingly. She began inviting society ladies to tea specifically to compare Charlotte unfavorably against their fashionable daughters. She made pointed remarks about Charlotte's father's failing estate at every opportunity, always careful to phrase her cruelty as simple observation rather than outright insult, so that objecting to it only made Charlotte appear overly sensitive. "I do not understand why you tolerate her," Charlotte said one evening, after a particularly cutting remark about her father's financial ruin had left her stinging through an entire dinner. Edmund's expression darkened. "She is my mother. I owe her a certain deference. But I do not tolerate cruelty toward my wife, and I have told her so plainly, more than once. She does not seem to listen." "No," he admitted, "she does not. I am working on that." True to his word, Charlotte began to notice small changes. Edmund started arranging matters so that his mother's teas occurred while he and Charlotte were occupied elsewhere, sparing Charlotte the worst of the dowager's company. He began seeking Charlotte out deliberately, walking with her through the gardens in the late afternoons, asking her opinion on estate matters that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with genuine interest in what she thought. One afternoon, walking along the edge of the ornamental lake, Edmund stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "May I tell you something I have not told anyone else in this house?" "Of course. When my father died, I was not ready. I did not know how to manage tenant disputes or negotiate with creditors or run a household of this size. I made mistakes, terrible ones, in those first years, and my mother never once let me forget them. I built walls around myself because it was easier than facing how frightened I truly was." He paused, staring out over the still water. "I tell you this because I do not want you to mistake my quietness for coldness. I am not cold, Charlotte. I am simply careful, because I learned young how much it costs to fail the people who depend on you." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal address he had maintained since their wedding. Charlotte felt the small intimacy of it settle warmly in her chest. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I understand you a little better now." "I hope," he said, "that in time, you might understand me a great deal better still." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, and for the first time since the carriage had carried her away from her childhood home, toward an uncertain future, Charlotte allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. But hope, she would soon learn, was a fragile thing in a house still shadowed by old grudges and older secrets, and the Dowager Duchess was not a woman who surrendered her disapproval easily. That very week, a letter arrived at Ashworth Hall addressed to the Dowager, bearing a seal Charlotte did not recognize, and though she thought little of it at the time, She would remember it later as the first quiet warning of trouble still to come. The letter that had arrived at Ashworth Hall came from Lord Gerald Fenwick, a nobleman whose name still made Charlotte's stomach tighten whenever she heard it spoken. 2 years before her marriage, Fenwick had courted her with practiced charm, promising affection he never intended to keep, only to abandon the engagement publicly the moment a wealthier bride caught his interest. He had done it cruelly, announcing his change of heart at a crowded ball rather than in private, ensuring Charlotte's humiliation played out before half of London society. She had spent months afterward barely able to leave her father's house, the whispers and pitying glances following her everywhere she went. She had not known, until the Dowager mentioned it with obvious satisfaction at breakfast, that Fenwick and the Dowager Duchess Margaret were old family friends, and that he had been invited to a hunting gathering at Ashworth Hall the following fortnight. "I thought it only proper to invite him," the Dowager said, watching Charlotte's face carefully over the rim of her teacup. "He is, after all, an old acquaintance of the family. I trust there will be no awkwardness." Charlotte kept her expression carefully neutral, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "None at all, Your Grace." Edmund, seated beside her, set down his fork with more force than necessary. "Mother, you know precisely what history exists between Fenwick and my wife. I find it curious that you extended this invitation without consulting either of us." "I extended it because this remains my house as much as yours, Edmund, whatever title you carry," the Dowager replied coolly. "And because I believe your wife could benefit from learning to hold her composure in difficult company. Society will not always be kind to her, and she must learn to bear it gracefully." The cruelty of the remark hung in the air, deliberate and precise. Charlotte excused herself from the table before her composure could crack entirely, retreating to the gardens where she could breathe without an audience watching her struggle. Edmund found her there 20 minutes later, seated on a stone bench beneath a bare oak tree, her arms wrapped around herself against the autumn chill. "I am sorry," he said, sitting beside her without invitation. "I will have the invitation withdrawn." "You cannot," Charlotte said quietly. "Your mother has already sent it. Withdrawing it now would only cause more talk, more speculation about why. I would rather face him and prove I have nothing left to fear from his opinion." "You owe him nothing, Charlotte. Not your composure, not your grace, not even your presence in the same room. Perhaps not, but I owe myself the chance to stand before him without flinching. I spent a year hiding from what he did to me. I do not wish to hide any longer." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening his features. "Then I will stand beside you when he arrives, and he will understand very clearly that you are protected, valued, and wanted in this house, whatever cruelty he once showed you." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something warmer and far more dangerous to the walls she had built. "Thank you, Edmund." It was the first time she had used his given name in return, and the small smile that crossed his face told her he had noticed. The days leading up to the hunting party passed in tense preparation. The Dowager threw herself into arranging every detail with theatrical enthusiasm, ensuring the guest list included several of London's sharpest gossips alongside Fenwick himself. Charlotte suspected, though she could not prove it, that the Dowager hoped to see her wilt under the pressure, perhaps even hoped Fenwick's presence might remind Edmund of a more fashionable, less scandal-touched bride he might have chosen instead. If that was truly her hope, she would be disappointed. Fenwick arrived on a crisp autumn morning, as handsome and self-assured as Charlotte remembered, his charm as polished as ever and just as hollow beneath the surface. He greeted her with an exaggerated bow and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Lady Ashworth," he said, savoring her new title as though testing it for weakness. "How fortune has smiled upon you. I confess I did not expect to see you settled so comfortably, given how our own history concluded." "Fortune had very little to do with it, my lord," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "My husband is a man of honor. A quality I understand you have always struggled to demonstrate yourself." A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the small crowd of guests who had overheard the exchange. Fenwick's smile tightened, though he recovered quickly, turning the conversation toward safer subjects with practiced ease. But Charlotte caught Edmund's eye across the terrace, and the pride shining there warmed her more than any fire ever could. The hunting party itself passed with careful civility on the surface, though tension ran beneath every interaction like a current under ice. Fenwick made several attempts throughout the following days to catch Charlotte alone, ostensibly to apologize for the past, though Charlotte suspected his true purpose ran deeper. She refused each attempt politely but firmly, always ensuring another guest remained within earshot. On the third evening, during a formal dinner in the Great Hall, Fenwick made his true intentions clear. Rising his glass in a toast that seemed innocent enough on the surface, he addressed the table with false warmth. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth," he said, "and to marriages built on far sturdier foundations than mere affection. I dare say practical arrangements often prove wiser than romantic ones. Wouldn't you agree, Lady Ashworth, given your own experience with romantic disappointment?" The barb was subtle enough that most guests missed its cruelty entirely, mistaking it for polite conversation. But Charlotte understood exactly what he intended, reminding the entire table, and Edmund most of all, that her marriage had begun in obligation rather than affection, and implying that obligation was all it would ever amount to. Before Charlotte could formulate a response, Edmund rose from his seat, his expression calm but his eyes hard as flint. "I would agree," he said, "that practical arrangements can indeed prove wiser than romantic ones, my lord, though perhaps not for the reasons you intend. My marriage began from necessity, it is true, but I have found, in the weeks since, that necessity has grown into something far deeper than any romantic courtship I have witnessed among London's fashionable circles, including your own. I count myself fortunate that circumstance brought me a wife of such courage and character, rather than one swayed only by empty charm." The silence that followed was absolute. Fenwick's face flushed dark with humiliation, the tables neatly turned upon him before the very guests he had hoped would witness Charlotte's discomfort. Charlotte sat frozen, her heart hammering, scarcely able to believe the quiet fierceness with which Edmund had defended her, publicly and without hesitation. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the great house had settled into silence once more, Charlotte found Edmund in the library, staring into the dying fire. "You did not need to say all that," she said softly from the doorway. "I meant every word," he replied, turning to face her. "Charlotte, I know we began this marriage as strangers bound by circumstance, but these past weeks have shown me something I did not expect to find. I admire you. I trust you. And I find myself, against every careful instinct I have spent years building, beginning to care for you far more than duty requires." Charlotte crossed the room slowly, her heart full in a way she had not allowed herself to feel since before Fenwick's cruel betrayal had taught her to guard herself so carefully. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This unexpected kindness of yours, it has done more to heal me than I ever thought possible." For a long moment they simply stood together in the firelight, the walls between them finally beginning to crumble in earnest. But even as the warmth of the moment settled around them, Charlotte could not shake the memory of Fenwick's humiliated, furious expression as he had left the dinner table early, nor the quiet, calculating look he had given her on his way out the door. A man like Fenwick did not forgive public humiliation easily, and something told her this would not be the last they saw of his scheming. She was right to worry. 2 days later, before departing Ashworth Hall, Fenwick sought a private audience with the Dowager Duchess Margaret, and whatever passed between them in that closed study left the Dowager smiling in a way Charlotte had not seen since her arrival, a smile that promised trouble still waiting to unfold. Winter arrived at Ashworth Hall early that year, dusting the gardens with frost and forcing the household indoors where fires burned late into every evening. Charlotte found herself grateful for the enforced closeness it brought between her and Edmund, long evenings spent together in the library, reading aloud or discussing estate matters. The careful distance of their early marriage replaced by something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. Edmund had begun including her in decisions no husband of his standing was obligated to share. He asked her opinion on which tenant families needed additional support through the harsh months ahead. He consulted her on matters of household budgeting, impressed by the practical sense she had developed managing her father's much smaller estate through years of financial strain. Slowly, steadily, Charlotte began to feel less like a stranger occupying a borrowed life, and more like a true partner in building something lasting. The Dowager Duchess Margaret's hostility, however, had not softened. If anything, it had grown sharper and more calculated since Fenwick's visit, though she had grown careful enough to disguise her cruelty behind polished courtesy whenever Edmund was present to witness it. Charlotte noticed the change but said nothing, unwilling to burden Edmund with battles she believed she could fight herself. She was wrong to think she could fight them alone. It began with small things. A missing letter from her father that never seemed to arrive, though the post regularly brought correspondence for everyone else in the household. A servant reassigned without explanation, one Charlotte had grown fond of and trusted. Whispered comments from the Dowager's circle of society friends, repeated back to Charlotte through well-meaning acquaintances, suggesting that the young Duchess had schemed her way into marriage through calculated manipulation of a grieving, dutiful young duke. Charlotte tried to dismiss the rumors as idle gossip, the natural consequence of a hasty marriage that had denied society its usual entertainment of watching a proper courtship unfold. But the rumors grew more pointed, more specific, containing details about her family's debts that only someone within the household could have known. She confronted the dowager directly one afternoon, finding her alone in the drawing room arranging fresh flowers with practiced elegance. "Your Grace, I must ask you plainly, have you been speaking to society about the circumstances of my father's debts?" The dowager did not look up from her flowers. "I speak of many things to many people, my dear. I could not possibly account for every word that leaves my mouth in a given week. These are not idle words. Someone has been spreading very specific, very damaging information about my family, and I find it difficult to believe the source lies anywhere but this household." The dowager finally looked up, her expression cool and unreadable. "Perhaps you should ask yourself whether marrying a duke under such circumstances was ever likely to remain a secret forever. Society has a way of discovering inconvenient truths, my dear, regardless of who does or does not speak them aloud. It was not a confession, but it was not a denial either, and Charlotte left the room with her suspicions only strengthened, though she still lacked any proof solid enough to bring before Edmund. That evening, Anne Whitfield arrived at Ashworth Hall for an extended visit, having finally secured leave from her own family obligations to see how her dearest friend fared in her new life. Charlotte had never been so relieved to see a familiar, trustworthy face, and the two women spent hours that first night catching up on everything that had passed since Charlotte's hasty wedding. "You look well," Anne observed, studying Charlotte carefully across the fire in her private sitting room. "Happier than your letters suggested you would be, if I am honest." "I am happier than I expected to be," Charlotte admitted. "Edmund has proven far kinder than I dared hope. But something troubles me, Anne, and I do not know how to address it without proof." She explained the rumors, the missing letters, the suspicious pattern of information that seemed to flow directly from the household into London society's most eager ears. Anne listened carefully, her expression growing thoughtful. "Have you considered that the dowager might not be acting entirely alone in this?" Anne asked. "You mentioned Lord Fenwick visited recently, and that whatever passed between him and the dowager afterward left her particularly pleased with herself. It seems possible the two of them share more than simple family friendship at this point, perhaps a shared interest in seeing your marriage fail." The thought had not fully occurred to Charlotte before, but once spoken aloud, it settled into place with unsettling clarity. Fenwick had been humiliated publicly by Edmund's defense of her. He would want revenge, and the dowager's disapproval of the marriage gave him a willing accomplice already embedded within the household itself. Charlotte brought her suspicions to Edmund that same night, laying out everything she had noticed, every small suspicious detail she had gathered over the preceding weeks. Edmund listened in grim silence, his expression darkening with each new revelation. "I should have seen this sooner," he said finally. "My mother has never forgiven me for marrying without her approval, and Fenwick has never forgiven either of us for the humiliation he suffered at that dinner. Together, they make a dangerous combination. What do we do?" "We proceed carefully," Edmund said. "If we confront them directly without proof, they will simply deny everything and grow more cautious in their scheming. Better to watch, to gather what evidence we can, and to ensure they underestimate us until we are ready to act." It was a sensible plan, and Charlotte agreed to it readily enough, though a quiet unease settled over her in the days that followed, a sense that the true danger still waited ahead of them, gathering strength in the shadows while she and Edmund tried to move carefully through a house no longer entirely safe. The unease proved well-founded. Barely a week later, a letter arrived at Ashworth Hall, bearing news that would test everything Charlotte and Edmund had built between them, and prove exactly how far their enemies were willing to go to see their marriage destroyed. The letter arrived on a bitter, snow-laden morning, delivered not by the usual post but by a private courier who refused to identify who had sent him. Edmund opened it in his study, and Charlotte watched the color drain from his face as he read the contents, his hands tightening on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. "What is it?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. He set the letter on the desk without a word, and Charlotte picked it up herself, her eyes scanning the elegant, damning script. It claimed, in careful and convincing detail, that Charlotte had been seen meeting privately with Lord Fenwick on multiple occasions since her marriage, in secluded corners of the estate, in the village beyond the gates, even once in London during a shopping excursion she had taken with Anne. The letter suggested, with poisonous subtlety, that Charlotte had never truly abandoned her old attachment to Fenwick, that her marriage to Edmund had been a calculated escape from her father's debts while her true affections remained elsewhere. "None of this is true," Charlotte said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "I have not spoken to Fenwick since he left this house after the hunting party. You know this, Edmund. You have been beside me nearly every day since." "I know," Edmund said quietly, though something troubled and uncertain still lingered in his eyes. "But this letter is detailed, Charlotte. It names specific dates, specific places. Whoever wrote it went to great lengths to make it convincing." "You cannot possibly believe it." "I do not want to believe it," he said, and the distinction in his words cut deeper than any outright accusation could have. "But I would be lying if I said it has not planted a doubt I did not have before reading it." The wound of his hesitation struck harder than Charlotte expected. She had trusted him, had let down every wall she had spent a year building after Fenwick's original betrayal, and now, faced with a stranger's lying words, she watched that same trust flicker uncertainly in her own husband's eyes. "Then I suppose we shall have to discover who wrote it," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, though her heart felt as though it were breaking. "Because I will not spend my marriage defending myself against lies I have no way to disprove beyond my own word." Anne, still visiting at Ashworth Hall, proved instrumental in the days that followed. Drawing on her own connections among London's household staff, she quietly gathered information about the servants who had come and gone from Ashworth Hall in recent weeks, cross-referencing their movements against the dates named in the poisoned letter. Her patient investigation revealed that a scullery maid recently dismissed from the household, one who had been let go under circumstances Charlotte now recognized as suspiciously convenient, had been seen in London in the company of a gentleman matching Fenwick's description barely a fortnight before the letter arrived. Armed with this thread of evidence, Charlotte and Edmund traveled to London together, seeking out the dismissed maid at the modest lodging house where Anne's inquiries had located her. The young woman, clearly frightened and remorseful once confronted directly, confessed everything within minutes. Fenwick had approached her shortly after her dismissal, offering a generous sum of money in exchange for fabricating detailed, convincing accounts of meetings between Charlotte and himself that had never actually taken place. The dowager, the maid admitted tearfully, had arranged her dismissal specifically to create the opportunity for Fenwick's approach, ensuring the maid would be desperate enough for money to agree to the scheme. Charlotte felt a strange mixture of relief and fresh anger wash over her as the truth finally emerged into the light. Relief that her innocence could now be proven beyond doubt. Anger that Edmund's mother had proven willing to go to such lengths, sacrificing an innocent servant's reputation and livelihood, all to see her son's marriage destroyed. Edmund's fury, when the maid finished her confession, burned cold and controlled rather than loud. "You will be compensated fairly for the wrong done to you," he told the trembling young woman, "and you need fear no further consequence from this household. The blame rests entirely with those who manipulated you, not with you yourself." The maid wept with gratitude, and Charlotte found herself, despite everything, grateful for the compassion Edmund extended even in the midst of his own justified anger. The journey back to Ashworth Hall passed in tense silence, both of them absorbing the full weight of what they had uncovered. It was Edmund who finally broke the quiet, somewhere along the darkening road, his voice heavy with regret. "I should never have doubted you, even for a moment," he said. "I let a stranger's lies plant uncertainty where none should have existed. I am ashamed of that, Charlotte, more than I can properly express." "You believed a very convincing lie," Charlotte said, though the hurt still lingered beneath her measured words. "I understand why it shook you, but I need you to understand, Edmund, that I have already survived one man's betrayal in my life. I do not think I have the strength left to survive doubt from the one person I had finally allowed myself to trust completely." "Then let me prove, from this day forward, that I am worthy of that trust," Edmund said, reaching across the carriage to take her hand in his. "Whatever my mother and Fenwick intend next, I promise you this. I will stand beside you, unwavering, and I will make certain the whole of society knows exactly where my loyalty lies." Charlotte studied his face in the dim carriage light, searching for any remaining trace of the doubt that had wounded her so deeply, and found instead only fierce, unwavering sincerity. Slowly, cautiously, she let her fingers curl around his. "Then let us finish what they started," she said. "Let us make certain they regret ever underestimating us." They arrived back at Ashworth Hall to find the Dowager Duchess Margaret waiting in the drawing room, her composure already cracking at the edges when she saw the grim determination on both their faces. She knew, before either of them spoke a single word, that her scheme had unraveled entirely, and that whatever consequences followed would be severe indeed. The confrontation in the drawing room was quieter than Charlotte had expected, though no less devastating for its restraint. Edmund laid out the evidence methodically, the The maid's confession, the dates and payments, the clear trail leading back to Fenwick's approach, and the dowager's convenient dismissal of an innocent servant. Margaret's face grew paler with each detail, though she maintained her composure through sheer force of will, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I did what I believed necessary," she said finally when Edmund finished. "This marriage was beneath you, Edmund, a penniless bride from a disgraced family, forced upon you by circumstance, rather than chosen through proper courtship. I only wished to see you free of an arrangement I believed would damage this family's standing for generations to come." "You wish to see me controlled," Edmund said, his voice hard and unflinching. "You have never forgiven me for making decisions without your approval, not since Father died and left me this title, before either of us were ready for it. This was never truly about Charlotte, Mother. This was about your own fear of losing influence over my life." The dowager's composure finally cracked, tears gathering in eyes that had shown Charlotte nothing but coldness since her arrival. "I only wanted what was best for this family." "Then you have a great deal to learn about what is truly best," Edmund said, "because what is best for this family is a wife who has shown more courage, more integrity, and more genuine care for this household than you have demonstrated in years. I love Charlotte, Mother, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because she has proven herself, time and again, worthy of that love. I will not have you scheme against her again, in this house or any other." Charlotte felt her breath catch at the words, spoken so plainly and so publicly for the first time. Love. He had said it without hesitation, without the careful reserve that had defined their relationship for so many months. Margaret, faced with the full weight of her son's fury and the undeniable evidence of her own cruelty, finally relented, agreeing to a temporary removal to the family's smaller property in the countryside, where she could reflect on her actions away from the household she had so thoroughly disrupted. Fenwick, when confronted separately by Edmund at his London club before an audience of his own peers, found his reputation permanently damaged, his scheming exposed to precisely the society circles whose good opinion he had always valued above all else. He departed London within the month, his name whispered thereafter only in connection with the scandal that had finally, thoroughly ruined him. With the threats finally cleared away, Charlotte and Edmund found themselves, for the first time since their hasty wedding, free to build their marriage without the shadow of scheming relatives or vengeful former suitors hanging over every quiet moment together. Spring arrived at Ashworth Hall with a warmth that seemed to mirror the transformation within its walls. The gardens bloomed vibrant and full, and Charlotte found herself walking them each morning not out of loneliness, as she once had, but out of genuine joy in the life she had built. Edmund joined her on these walks whenever his duties allowed, and their conversations had long since shed every trace of the stiff formality that had marked their earliest days together. One evening, as the sun set golden over the ornamental lake where Edmund had first confided his fears to her many months before, he took her hand and led her to the very same spot, a small smile playing at his lips. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how frightened you must have been, arriving here as a stranger, forced into a marriage you never chose." "I remember it well," Charlotte said softly. "I want you to know that I am grateful, every single day, that fate brought us together in that carriage, however unwillingly either of us entered into it. I do not believe I could have found a more remarkable partner had I searched the whole of England for a proper courtship." Charlotte felt tears gathering, warm and joyful this time rather than born of fear or grief. "I did not expect to find happiness in a forced marriage, Edmund, but I have found more than happiness here. I have found a true partner, a true friend, and a love I never dared hope to have after everything that came before." "Then let me make one final promise to you," Edmund said, kneeling before her beside the still waters of the lake, taking both her hands in his. "I promise that whatever trials still wait for us in the years ahead, I will face them beside you, not as duty demands, but because I choose you, Charlotte, every single day, for the rest of our lives together." Charlotte laughed through her tears, pulling him up to meet her properly, and there beside the lake where their friendship had first truly begun to bloom, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth sealed a love that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings into something neither of them would ever again take for granted. The household staff, watching from the windows of the great house, smiled knowingly at the sight, for they had witnessed the transformation unfold slowly over the preceding months, watched a cold and dutiful arrangement bloom gradually into genuine devotion. Mrs. Baxter, still teaching Charlotte new recipes in the kitchen each week, often remarked to the younger staff that she had never seen the young Duke so at ease, so quick to smile, since long before his father's death had forced the weight of the title upon his young shoulders. News of the reconciled marriage, and of Fenwick's thorough disgrace, spread through London society within weeks, and where once whispers had painted Charlotte as a calculating bride who had trapped a grieving duke into an unwanted union, the story now told was entirely different. Society spoke instead of a duke who had chosen, again and again, to defend and cherish his wife against every scheme arrayed against her, and of a duchess whose quiet courage had won not only her husband's love but the respect of the very circles that had once doubted her. By midsummer, Charlotte received word that her father's health had improved considerably, his debts long since settled, and his spirit lifted by news of his daughter's genuine happiness. He visited Ashworth Hall for the first time since the wedding, and watching him walk the gardens beside Edmund, deep in easy conversation about crop rotations and tenant welfare, Charlotte felt the last remaining shadow of guilt from her hasty, forced marriage finally lift away entirely. What had begun as a transaction born of desperation had transformed, through patience, honesty, and unexpected kindness, into a partnership neither of them would trade for any grand romance born of ordinary courtship. Charlotte Ashworth, once a frightened bride facing a stranger at the altar, had found in that same stranger a devoted husband, a steadfast friend, and a love that would carry them both through whatever the years still had waiting ahead. 2 years passed at Ashworth Hall, and the estate that had once felt cold and unfamiliar to Charlotte had long since become the truest home she had ever known. The tenant farms Edmund had worked so hard to save now flourished under careful management, their harvests strong enough that the whole surrounding village spoke gratefully of the young duke's steady, generous leadership. The great house itself, once heavy with the dowager's disapproval, now rang often with laughter, warmth radiating through halls that had for so long known only formality and restraint. Charlotte often thought back to that first carriage ride, the fear that had gripped her as the gray towers of Ashworth Hall first came into view, and marveled at how completely her life had changed since that frightened, uncertain day. She had arrived a stranger bound by duty. She remained now a wife bound by love, chosen freely and completely by a man who had proven, time and again, that his devotion ran far deeper than any obligation ever could. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, after nearly a year in quiet reflection at the family's countryside property, had written to Edmund requesting reconciliation, her letter carrying a humility Charlotte had never witnessed from her before. Edmund, after careful consideration and long conversation with Charlotte, agreed to a cautious renewal of the relationship, though the Dowager understood clearly that any return to her old cruelty would end the arrangement permanently. To everyone's quiet surprise, Margaret had kept her word, softening gradually into a grandmother whose fierce protectiveness, once turned against Charlotte, now extended warmly toward the newest member of the family. For in the nursery at Ashworth Hall, a small child now slept peacefully each night, a daughter born the previous spring who had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's quiet determination. Edmund doted on the child with a tenderness that surprised even those who had watched his transformation over the preceding years, carrying her through the gardens each evening and pointing out the same stone bench where he had first confided his fears to Charlotte so long before. "She will grow up knowing love, not obligation," Charlotte said one evening, watching Edmund cradle their daughter beneath the same oak tree where their own understanding had first begun to bloom. "That is more than either of us dared hope for, when we stood at that altar as strangers. She will grow up knowing that even the most unlikely beginnings can become the truest love a person could ever hope to find," Edmund replied, drawing Charlotte close beside him as the sun set gold and warm over the gardens they had both come to cherish. Just as her mother and father discovered, against every expectation either of us carried into that cold chapel on our wedding day, Anne Whitfield, now a frequent and beloved guest at Ashworth Hall, often remarked that she had never seen two people more perfectly matched, despite the unconventional circumstances that had first brought them together. Mrs. Baxter continued teaching Charlotte new recipes each season, and Peter, still tending the stables, told the newest grooms stories of how their young duke had once been a frightened boy forced too soon into responsibility, and how love, patient and unexpected, had finally taught him how to laugh again. The scandal of Fenwick's scheming faded gradually from London's memory, replaced eventually by newer gossip and fresher stories, though Charlotte never forgot the lesson those difficult months had taught her. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but only through honesty, patience, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most, however uncertain the path toward healing might seem at first. As autumn returned once more to Ashworth Hall, bringing with it the same crisp air that had first carried Charlotte's carriage toward an uncertain future years before, she stood at the same tall window where she had first watched Edmund confide his loneliness beneath the moonlight. She thought of the frightened bride she had once been, certain that duty alone would define the whole of her marriage, and smiled softly at how wonderfully wrong that fear had proven to be. Behind her, she heard Edmund's familiar footsteps approaching, their daughter's soft laughter carrying from the nursery down the hall, and the warm, steady sound of a household finally, completely at peace. Whatever trials had once threatened to tear their unlikely marriage apart, Charlotte knew now, standing in the golden light of that autumn evening, that nothing could unmake the love they had built together, patiently and deliberately, out of the coldest of beginnings. It had started as a forced marriage born of desperation and debt. It had become, through unexpected kindness and unwavering devotion, the truest love either of them had ever known, a love strong enough to weather every scheme, every doubt, and every trial the years had placed before them, and strong enough still to carry them both, hand in hand, into whatever future still lay ahead.